In this session, we will speak about the final stage in the history of Ontario wine. The mid-70s brought about some very significant changes in Ontario's wine industry, and these changes, plus several other important factors, helped to form the wine industry that exists and thrives in Ontario today. Following the issuance of the first new winery license since the end of Prohibition to Donald Zeraldo and Carl Kaiser of Inniskillen Winery in 1974, the face of the Ontario wine industry was to change forever. In the 1970s and 80s, new wineries were opening all over the place. Just look at this impressive list of wineries that opened soon after the government started to issue these new winery licenses. The industry was certainly in a major growth spurt. All of these wineries remain in business today in some form or another, and the vast majority form the foundation of the world-class wine regions in Ontario. You might ask, what were the old boys doing at this time? Of course, by old boys we are talking about the established, successful wineries who had been around for a while already. Wineries such as Bright's, Andres, Jordan, Chateauguay, Barnes, and London wineries. All were focused on vinifera and preferred hybrid wines, and these were beginning to sell quite well. Bright's was now a publicly traded company, and the winemaker was a fellow named Hernan Gras, who is now the owner of Montgras Winery in Chile, his home country. Harry Hatch Jr. was in the marketing department, and the industry was employing enthusiastic young winemakers. The region's growers were planting these varieties as the commercial success and vineyard potential of hybrids and vinifera in the best sites was starting to become quite obvious. However, imports were dominating Canadian wine sales. Wine producers in Ontario had to react to this changing market. Their strategy included the release of more dry table wines as opposed to the pop wines and fortified wines they'd been relying on up to this point. They started to use labels suggesting an association with European classics. And, of course, they increased the planting of estate vinifera vineyards. Supplies of local vinifera grapes were still insufficient, however. This situation required changes. The first response to the growing influx and popularity of import wines was to release more table wines in the style of classic wines from Europe. Wineries were riding on the coattails of other successful international wine regions by labeling their wines with references to fine regions such as Chablis, Sauternes, or Burgundy. Le Pied-d'Or was a successful wine in France, so the Canadians came out with Domaine d'Or, or L'Ambiance in Canada. Black Tower was successful in Germany, so we came out with our version, Hochtaler and Alpenweiss. And Italian wines like Colli Albani were selling very well in our market, so we produced the Canadian equivalent called Collio Bianco. The fact that in 1976 interest-free loans were available to those willing to pull out old varieties and replant with new vinifera varieties would seem a huge incentive. However, due to the grape shortage, growers were selling all they could grow and didn't feel the need to take on any additional risk. The free trade agreement signed between Canada and the USA in 1989 made it imperative that with the growing influx of high-quality American wines, Ontario simply had to do something drastic to compete, so the Ontario government rolled out a grape pull-out program, encouraging growers to remove and destroy the less desirable hybrids and Vitis labrusca vines. They would be paid well for this if they elected to move forward with such drastic measures. Meanwhile, the wine industry was starting to lobby the government in the hopes provincial support would alleviate some of the challenges the industry was facing. Lobbying led to the first Wine Content Act of 1983, which permitted the use of 30% imported wine to be blended into domestic wines. Labrusca was still permitted at this time, and the 902 rule permitted wineries to stretch as many as 902 liters of juice from 1 ton of grapes. Keep in mind the industry standard today for quality wine is something closer to 6 or 650 liters per ton. Clearly, the industry was in a major state of flux. In the early 1980s, Don Zeraldo of Inniskillen was pushing to create quality and production standards in order to protect both the producers and consumers looking for high quality, 100% locally grown and made wines. Niagara Quality Alliance was formed as a result. It was then called the Niagara Vintners Quality Alliance, and finally the Vintners Quality Alliance. Other individuals involved in the early days of Vintners Quality Alliance were Len Penichetti of Cave Spring, Peter Gamble, and Paul Bosque of Chateau de Charme. The LCBO was approached for organization of a sensory panel and lab tests in order to test the wines for ultimate approval by the province's largest buyer. Much discussion focused around which hybrids, if any, would be permitted in this new legal framework. After many years of discussion, planning, and strategizing, the VQA became provincial law in 1999, and it is known today as the VQA Act. The Vintners Quality Alliance, or VQA. VQA Ontario's goal is to build a strong and credible appellation system, supported by quality and label integrity, and to raise the recognition and knowledge of each of Ontario's wine appellations and their unique features. So, in the early 1980s, some things were going well, and some others were not going so well. The 1980s were successful, however, there was a rather nasty economic situation brewing, or should I say, fermenting. As mentioned, by 1976, imports had outsold domestic wines in the LCBO, and much of the developed world was facing a serious economic recession. Because Brights was now a publicly traded company, it simply could not afford to lose its shirt, so they started to load excess vineyards because demand was low and there was a surplus of grapes and wine. By the early 1990s, others followed suit, and the 600 acres of research vineyards in the heart of Niagara grape country was sold. There was more bad news in the 1980s. The ethyl carbamate scandal. In 1979, an LCBO lab technician detected the presence of potentially higher than desirable levels of ethyl carbamate, a known carcinogen. While the LCBO discussed this concern confidentially with several wineries, the media finally got a hold of the story in 1985. Austria was in the midst of a diethylene glycol scandal which was hugely damaging to that country, and when the news of the cover-up of this carcinogen in Ontario wines came out, it became officially a scandal. The good news was that nobody was intentionally doing anything wrong, unlike the Austrian situation where diethylene glycol was added to enhance the overall mouthfeel and body of wines that were due to be exported out to other countries for blending. In Ontario, this was simply a case of an ingredient doing something that winemakers didn't expect it to do. Urea, which is a yeast nutrient, is used as an easy conversion through yeast metabolism into ethyl carbamate as an end product. It's especially bad in fortified wines due to the heating and resulting concentration of this compound. 30 micrograms per liter are permitted for table wines, and 100 micrograms per liter are permitted for fortified wines. But unfortunately, the lab tests were demonstrating that some wines had higher than acceptable levels. Subsequent to this discovery and investigation, wineries started to pay more attention to this, and alternative yeast nutrients were found, thus all but eliminating the concerns around this compound. But it did set the industry back. When Brian Mulroney and the Progressive Conservatives, were swept into power again in 1988 with a majority government, the free trade deal which had been brewing with the United States was all but assured. Recall that in Ontario, the 65% LCBO markup difference, which up until that point favored Ontario wines over imports, was eliminated. This put a huge amount of pressure on Ontario wineries to react. Premier David Peterson, who was keen to help his important provincial wine industry, demanded that members of his government, wine industry and grape growers get together and negotiate a deal that would be palatable for the feds, the U.S. negotiators, and the domestic industry in general. The Wine Content Act of 1983 was further refined in 1988, so no more Labrusca was permitted, water additions were limited now, and up to 70% of foreign wine was permitted in cellared in Canada blends. Further, there were significant federal and provincial funds made available to assist growers and wineries through this transition. Specifically, they were to be paid to pull out undesirable Labrusca and hybrid varieties and replant with vinifera or some other more viable crop. Visit the CBC archive for more information. The result of this compensation plan and the growing realization that these undesirable varieties simply weren't going to be part of the future of Ontario's wine industry led to 8,200 acres of these grapes being pulled out. This was roughly half the acreage of Ontario at the time and remains roughly half even today. Some growers replanted with vinifera, whilst others leased the land for other agricultural uses. Those that didn't plant vinifera weren't willing to take the risk, considering the cost that they had to input into vinifera and the sensitivity of these varieties to our erratic Ontario weather. Believe it or not, by 2001, still only 57% of grapes harvested in Ontario were from Vitis vinifera grape varieties. Remarkably, visionaries like Bill Lenko, Len Pettichetti, Paul Bosc, the Speck brothers, and John Mary Nissen, who had the foresight and courage to focus on Vitis vinifera, were left out of this scheme, even as they were paving the road for the future of Ontario wines. The Wine Content Act today permits 25%, or I should say demands 25% Ontario grapes be in the blended wine, plus up to 75% grapes from another country. So for example, if I was to take 25% Ontario grapes and 75% grapes from Chile, I could in fact make an international Canadian blend wine, or an ICB wine. There was a devastating frost in 2003, and at that time, VQA wines were permitted to have as little as ICB wines, or cellared in Canada wines as they were known at that time, were permitted to have as little as 1% VQA, or authentic Ontario wines, in order to alleviate some of the pressure on the supply of grapes. Some might ask, is this truth in labeling? Famed British wine writer Jancis Robinson was horrified, and you can visit this article to see a little more about her opinions on this subject. We can't pass through the 1980s without mentioning the arrival of ice wine in our industry. Ice wine might just be the most important export we produce in terms of wine, and is a hugely important part of our industry even today. Arguably the most important early success in Ontario's wine industry was when Enniskillen won the Grand Prix d'Honneur at the world's most important wine trade show, Vinexpo. It beat out a remarkable 4,000 other international wines to win this prestigious Best in Show trophy, and it really put Ontario ice wine on the international map. Thanks to Karl Kaiser and Ewald Reif for deciding to make ice wine in the early 1980s with Vidal grapes. Hillebrand and Pelee Island also followed in their footsteps, and many others have followed since. One of the largest wineries in Ontario history is Vincor. Vincor doesn't exist today because it's been purchased by another even larger winery named Constellation Brands, but it does pay us to spend a few moments speaking about the story of Vincor. Vincor was the brainchild of Donald Triggs and Alan Jackson. Donald Triggs was a brewery executive at Labatt's, and Labatt's owned a winery called Chateauguay and other wine companies in Canada and the United States. Labatt's was planning to focus on beer in the ever-changing and ever-competitive beer market, so they wanted to unload the wine division of their company, which was called Ridout Wines. Donald Triggs and his business colleague Alan Jackson, along with other managers and employees, managed to take over Chateauguay for $26.5 million. They changed the name of Chateauguay to Cartier Wines in 1989. Enniskillen was then added to the company in 1992, and after the merger with Bright's Wines in 1993, Vincor was created. Jackson Triggs wines were introduced in 1993, and they quickly became the largest producer of VQA wines in Canada. With Donald Triggs at the helm, Alan Jackson overseeing production, and Don Zeraldo of Enniskillen acting as a worldwide ambassador for ice wine and other wines, the company went from strength to strength. Vincor went public in 1996 and used the new funds to purchase wineries in the USA, Australia, New Zealand, and throughout Canada. Vincor was now the 4th largest wine company in North America and the 8th largest in the world. A joint venture with the Boisset family of Burgundy, France, led to the creation of Le Clos Jordan, soon to become the top Chardonnay and Pinot Noir producer in the province, if not the country. However, in 2005, a major drop in stock value for Vincor, following a very poor earnings report, left it vulnerable, and it was subsequently taken over by Constellation Brands, the largest wine company in the world, and it remains part of the Constellation family today. Beginning in or around the 1990s, there seemed to be two primary ways that developed for new wineries to be started in Ontario: the farmers and the millionaires. In many wine regions, the idea that a grape grower should make and sell their own wine is very normal and expected. If it's not profitable enough to sell grapes, then it makes sense to take those grapes which you work so hard to raise and turn them into a much more valuable finished product. In Ontario, the politics between grower and winery had become so entrenched that it was seen as crossing the invisible line for growers to become wineries. But the capital-intensive nature of the wine business means that for most growers to enter the wine business, they need to either have a rich uncle, aka an investor or partner, or be very skilled at piecing together a patchwork of workable, used, and home-fabricated equipment and do a lot of the work themselves or with family. There are many examples of great farmers who have gone on to have great success starting and running wineries. Daniel Lenko, the Hernders, John Neufeld at Palatine Hills, and Doug Whitty at 13th Street Winery, just to name a few. The second half, or second part of the industry, which seemed to be growing quite extensively in the 90s and 2000s, was the millionaires arriving on the scene. These were men and women who were wealthy due to hard work ethic and success in other fields. Capital was not an issue for them. The extravagance of some of the wineries they opened in Niagara is really quite something, especially compared to many of the ma and pa operations that had defined the industry for decades leading up to this point. The millionaires are focusing on the essential vineyard aspects, and wine quality is vital. All have done that very well. Some examples in the Ontario wine industry include Maury Taz, Martin Malivoire, Harold Teal of Hidden Bench, Fielding, and Stratus, just to name a few. So what does Ontario look like today? Well, there have been some recent changes which continue to shape the future of Ontario's wine industry. Sales are now permitted at farmers markets, which gives Ontario wineries yet another channel for sales and distribution, in addition to their own winery sales, online sales, restaurant or licensee sales, out-of-province sales, and LCBO sales, of course. Sales are soon to be permitted in grocery stores throughout the province. This is just in negotiation and determination right now. Packaging requirements have changed in Ontario as well and continue to do so, and VQA wine can now be bottled, or should I say packaged in keg and sold on tap in restaurants around the province. The technologies in Ontario continue to be enhanced with high-tech equipment arriving all the time, including special filters and things like optical sorters. Education in Ontario through Brock University, Niagara College, and various wine and sommelier organizations continues to grow, and the customers in Ontario and in fact Canada are more and more knowledgeable about wines, including their own domestic wines, than ever before. And finally, international wine conferences such as the International Cool Climate Chardonnay Celebration, or I4C, and the International Cool Climate Wine Symposium arrived on Ontario's doorstep, drawing many, many thousands of people from different countries, consumers and wine industry employees alike. Combined, all of these things suggest indeed that the future looks very bright for the Ontario wine industry.